They told me the mountain air would be too thin for my lungs. That's what my son said, standing in my kitchen 3 days before Thanksgiving. His shoulders hunched, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets like a boy caught doing something he knew was wrong. He didn't look at me at first. He stared at the countertop instead, tracing invisible lines with his eyes. "Mom, we love you," he said carefully. "But the lodge is at 8,000 feet. With your breathing issues, it's just not safe." Breathing issues? I almost laughed. Almost. I had bronchitis once. 4 years ago. A stubborn cough that lasted longer than it should have. And somehow, in the retelling of my life, that single winter illness had turned me into a woman made of glass. Fragile. Breakable. Something that needed to be handled gently or better yet, left behind. My daughter-in-law Karen stood beside him, nodding along with that practiced expression she uses when she wants to appear compassionate without actually committing to anything. She reached for my hand and squeezed it, her smile soft and sympathetic. "We'll do Christmas together instead," she said. "Something closer to sea level. Something more appropriate." There was that word again. Appropriate. It had started showing up everywhere after my 65th birthday, slipping into conversations like an uninvited guest. Appropriate restaurants. Appropriate travel. Appropriate expectations. As if turning 65 meant I had quietly crossed an invisible line from capable to inconvenient. My granddaughter Emma hugged me before they left, her small arms wrapping tightly around my waist. "I wish you could come, Grandma Dot," she whispered into my sweater. "I'll bring you back a pine cone." I smiled and kissed the top of her head, holding on a second longer than necessary. I stood in the doorway and watched their minivan disappear down Maple Street, the November wind cutting straight through my cardigan. When I closed the door, the house felt enormous. Every sound echoed. Every room felt like it was waiting for laughter that wouldn't come. Thanksgiving was supposed to be loud, messy, full of passing dishes and half-finished conversations. Instead, I was alone, deemed too fragile for the mountains. I told myself it was fine, that I understood, that they were only worried about me. But as the silence settled in, heavy and unmoving, a small, uncomfortable question began to take shape in my chest. And by the end of that week, I was going to discover just how carefully constructed that concern really was. Because the mountains weren't the real reason they left me behind. And what I saw next would change how I looked at my own son forever. Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly. No rushing footsteps. No clatter of pans. No argument over whether the turkey needed more salt. Just me, the hum of the refrigerator, and a pale slice of sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor. I made myself coffee and sat at the table I had refinished years ago with my own hands. I ran my fingers along the edge, remembering how my son once carved his initials into the underside when he was 10. I never sanded them out. I told myself it was because I liked the memory. That morning I wasn't so sure. My phone buzzed around 10. Not a call. A notification. A photo. It was posted by Karen. The image loaded slowly, line by line, and when it finally settled into focus, my stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. There they were. My son, Karen, Emma, standing on the lodge balcony, wrapped in thick sweaters, mountains rising behind them like something out of a travel magazine. Emma's cheeks were pink from the cold, her smile wide and unburdened. My son had his arm around Karen, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "Thankful for fresh air, family and new traditions." A small red heart followed it. New traditions. I stared at the screen, waiting for the wave of dizziness I had been warned about. The shortness of breath. The proof that they had been right to leave me behind. It didn't come. Instead, what settled into my chest was heavier. Slower. Colder. They weren't worried about my lungs. They were worried about inconvenience. More photos followed throughout the day. Emma roasting marshmallows. Karen laughing with a glass of wine. My son carving the turkey, my turkey recipe, passed down without so much as a mention. I closed the app, my hand steady in a way that surprised me. Later that afternoon, my son finally called. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." His voice was loud, cheerful, a little forced. "How are you feeling?" I looked at the empty chair across from me. "I'm breathing just fine," I said. There was a pause. A small one. But I heard it. "That's great. he replied quickly. We were just being cautious, you know? Cautious. Another careful word. He talked about the drive, the weather, the food. He never mentioned the photos. Never acknowledged the truth hanging between us like smoke. When he hung up, I didn't cry. I washed my mug. I wiped the counter. I folded a dish towel that didn't need folding. And then, for the first time since his father died, I did something I had avoided for years. I opened the locked drawer in my bedroom. Inside were the documents I rarely touched. Papers I had always assumed would one day belong to him simply because he was my son. That afternoon, a thought settled in with absolute clarity. Love should never require erasing yourself to be included. Because the next call I received wasn't about Thanksgiving at all. And it would force me to make a decision I had been postponing for decades. That night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked in familiar ways, the settling of old beams, the faint groan of the heating pipes, but everything felt sharper somehow, louder, as though it was mocking the silence that now lived in my kitchen, my dining room, my very chest. I sat up, drew the blanket around my shoulders and reached for my phone. Another notification. This time it wasn't photos. It was a bank alert. A large sum had been charged. My son's name was on it. My credit card. The one I had given him for emergencies. My hands went cold. I stared at the numbers line by line, heart drumming in a rhythm I couldn't control. Flights to Miami. A cruise with multiple stops. Excursion packages. A drink package. Specialty dining. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago they had lied to me. Not just about the air or the mountains or my health. About the very plan that would leave me alone on Thanksgiving, thinking it was safety when it was convenience and indulgence. I had always prided myself on being calm under pressure. On patience, on understanding, on giving second chances. But there was no room for patience now. No understanding. Just a raw, jagged awareness that my trust had been used as currency. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got out of bed. I put on my robe, felt the chill of the tile under my feet, and walked to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea. I drank it slowly, letting the warmth crawl from my throat down to my hands. Then I sat at the table where Roger used to sit, where my son had once leaned over, elbows on the wood, asking questions, sharing stories. Where I had laughed, scolded, comforted. The table was empty now. The chair across from me was empty. The heartache was heavy, but beneath it simmered something new, clarity. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the back of the card. A woman named Deborah answered. Patient. Calm. Polite. She walked me through each charge, confirming amounts, dates, and vendors. I could feel the power of that piece of plastic slipping from my son's hands, and it felt almost like breathing again after being underwater too long. Would you like to cancel the card? Deborah asked. Yes. Immediately. The words were smooth. Easy. They rang in my head like a bell. No pleading. No guilt. No hesitation. Just boundaries. I hung up, and for the first time that week, I felt something I hadn't in months. Control. The kind that comes not from fury, but from knowing you will not be used again. Outside, the leaves rustled in the November wind. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The ordinary world moved on. But inside my kitchen, something had shifted irrevocably. Because the card was just the beginning, and what I did next would shock them in ways they never expected. The next morning I woke to a sky the color of pewter. Clouds stretched thin and gray over Willowbrook. Thanksgiving had arrived in all its cold, quiet glory. I brewed coffee, the rich smell filling the kitchen. I moved slowly, deliberately. Toast browned in the toaster. Eggs sizzled in the pan. Simple things, small rituals, a grounding rhythm. For a moment, I let myself pretend it was normal. That the house was alive with laughter, the clatter of plates, the warmth of family gathered around me. But reality returned like a gust of wind through an open window. The chairs were empty, the laughter stolen. The phone buzzed. A call from Brian. Another from Karen. I didn't answer. Instead, I called the bank again. Kevin, the young branch manager who had known Roger, picked up. I explained what had happened. The charges were unauthorized, yes, but the deeper issue was trust, and that was beyond any account dispute. I revoked the power of attorney, put new security measures in place, claimed sole authority over my finances. Every word I spoke was deliberate, measured. I was reclaiming not just money
Kevin
but
nodded,
autonomy, quietly professional, understanding without judgment. He handed me the paperwork confirming everything. Brian would no longer touch a cent, no matter how much he pleaded or lied. Driving home, the streets were full of families preparing for the holiday. Casseroles in hand, turkeys in tow, children jumping into piles of leaves. Each scene was a mirror of the life I had been denied this year. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt a quiet, burning resolve. I would not be invisible. I would not be taken for granted. Back home, I set my own Thanksgiving table. Not grand, not showy. Just the basics. A chicken breast roasted with care, mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, green beans with a hint of butter. I lit a candle, the small flame flickering against the gray light from outside. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, honoring the ritual itself. The holiday had not been stolen from me. It had been mine to claim in its simplest, purest form. The first calls came at 7:30 that evening. I let them ring. And when the messages started, pleading, frantic, incredulous, I ignored them. There would be no bargaining, no compromise. I had drawn my line, and it would not be crossed. I fell asleep on the couch, the television murmuring news about far-off places, families I would never know. Outside, the world carried on in its ordinary way. But inside, something monumental had shifted. A new clarity, like light breaking through winter clouds, filled the space I had thought empty. I was still here. I still had agency. I still mattered. And as I sat in that quiet kitchen, alone yet unbowed, I knew one thing with perfect certainty. The real reckoning was yet to come, and they would not see it coming. Friday morning dawned sharp and clear, frost still clinging to the edges of the sidewalks. The world outside seemed ordinary, mundane, yet every familiar sound, the barking dog down the street, a car starting, the neighbor's radio spilling old jazz, felt amplified. I made coffee, the steam curling like tiny wisps of resolve in the air. Today was the day I would make choices for myself, not for anyone else. I called my lawyer, David Chan, whose voice carried the warmth of someone who had known my husband. "Dorothy," he said, "what can I do for you?" My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but anticipation. I needed to update my will immediately. Every instruction, every detail had to be precise. Brian would no longer be the sole inheritor. Emma, my granddaughter, would have a trust, hers and hers alone, untouched by her parents' interference until she turned 25. The rest would go to charities, the church, the food bank, the animal shelter, and the community center Roger had loved. David asked questions with calm precision, and I answered without hesitation. I thought about the cruise photos, the lies, the betrayal. I thought about standing alone at my kitchen table while my son sipped cocktails under the Caribbean sun, and I felt a clarity I had not known in years. This was not anger. This was reclamation. This was a woman deciding that she would no longer be invisible in her own life. The weekend passed in a blur of paperwork, signatures, and careful instructions. Each document I signed was a boundary, a shield, a declaration. Brian's access revoked. Karen's influence restricted. All avenues of manipulation closed. My heart was steady, my mind clear. I was acting not out of spite, but out of necessity. By Sunday evening, the family returned. I heard their car, the stomping footsteps, the doorbell ringing urgently. I opened the door. Brian stood there in a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, completely absurd against the November chill. Karen hovered behind him, arms crossed, Emma peeking out with wide eyes. "What the hell, Mom?" Brian started, his voice tense, defensive. I looked at him, calm, deliberate. I let him speak, recount the drama, justify their choices. And I listened. When he finally paused, I spoke. Slowly, firmly. I had revoked the power of attorney. I had restricted access to all my accounts. I had updated my will. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. For the first time I saw them, really saw them, not as my children but as people confronted with the consequences of their actions. And just as I thought the weekend storms had passed, a question hung in the air, one that neither of us could answer easily, and that would change everything between us. The house fell silent after Brian and Karen left. I closed the door, locking it, and leaned against it for a long moment. The chill of the November air followed me inside, but it felt like a cleansing frost, stripping away all pretense. I moved to the kitchen and found Emma sitting at the table, cookie crumbs dusting her small chin, tears glinting in her wide, innocent eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, voice trembling. "Are you and Daddy fighting?" I knelt to meet her gaze, taking her tiny hand in mine. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree, sweetheart," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean I love you any less." Her brows furrowed, a miniature map of confusion and worry. She didn't understand grown-up decisions, the kind that were heavy with years of trust and heartbreak. "Mommy says you're being difficult," she added, almost accusingly. I smiled, bittersweet. Maybe I was difficult. Maybe stubbornness and bravery were two sides of the same coin. "Maybe I am," I said. "But sometimes being difficult means standing up for yourself even when it's hard." Her eyes searched mine, trying to reconcile the warmth of her grandmother with the firmness in my voice. Slowly, she hugged me tight, holding on like she feared I might vanish into the shadows of a world that often treated adults like ghosts, invisible and replaceable. "I'll come back, Grandma," she whispered. "I promise." And in that small promise there was a spark of hope, a tether that tied her heart to mine. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but quiet in a way that allowed reflection, growth, and small victories. Brian's calls came sporadically, sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, always searching for access to the life I was reclaiming. Karen sent an email, long and reasoned, attempting to convince me I had overreacted. I didn't read it to the end. Some words weren't worth my energy. Christmas passed without fanfare or resentment. I celebrated with my friend Martha, sharing a simple ham and card games late into the evening. It wasn't family, but it was enough. It was a reminder that I could create joy for myself, even when others chose betrayal over connection. By January, I began volunteering at the community center, joining women who shared quiet understanding of disappointment, of trust broken, and yet of resilience that refused to wane. One afternoon, Gloria, a fellow volunteer, confided, "My daughter emptied my savings account last year. She needed it for her business. Failed 6 months later." I nodded slowly, understanding without judgment. "I'm not dead yet," I said. "There's time to rebuild." She smiled at me with steady eyes. The question lingered in my mind long after the conversation. Would I spend my time waiting for others to change, or would I devote it to living my own life? And then one cold February morning, a small package arrived that would remind me why boundaries mattered, but also why love, stubborn and enduring, could still find its way back. February arrived slowly, carrying with it the gray drizzle and lingering chill that Vermont is known for. The phone remained silent, and for the first time in months I didn't mind. I had learned to fill my days with purpose, with routines that reminded me I still existed beyond the expectations of others. Then one morning a small package appeared on the porch. No return address. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the handwriting. Slanted and uneven, unmistakably Emma's. I carried it inside carefully, as though holding a fragile piece of sunlight, and placed it on the kitchen table. Inside was a small jewelry box, and inside that, a bracelet made of colored beads spelling out "Grandma." I ran my fingers over the uneven letters, feeling the effort she had put into every twist and knot. Beneath the bracelet, a tiny folded note peeked out. I unfolded it carefully. "I made this at school. I miss you every day. Please don't forget me. Love, Emma." A lump rose in my throat, and before I knew it, tears blurred my vision. I sat at the kitchen table and cried for the first time in months. Not for myself, not for the betrayal, not for the cruise, not for the lies, but for her. For the granddaughter who had been caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes. For the relationship I longed to nurture. For the grandmother I wanted to be. Present, loving, patient, and brave. I put the bracelet on my wrist and didn't take it off. It felt like a promise pinned to my skin, a quiet anchor to a future that was still ours to shape. Winter gradually released its hold, and spring crept in cautiously. Snow melted in patches, revealing stubborn brown grass beneath, and I planted tulip bulbs along the walkway, something I hadn't done since Roger died. The earth smelled sweet and alive, and the simple act of digging and planting reminded me I was still here, still capable, still alive. Then one Sunday in March the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and found Brian standing there alone. No flip-flops this time, no Hawaiian shirt. Just a tired, hollowed man holding a folder, something heavier than any suitcase. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly, almost cautiously. No demands, no anger. I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Emma had eaten cookies months ago, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. He turned the folder over in his hands, the weight of unspoken confessions pressing down on us both. Finally, he broke the silence. Karen and I are separated, he said. I hadn't known. I wasn't sure how I felt, but his voice carried no accusation, no excuse, just truth. He opened the folder and slid it across the table. Pages and pages of handwriting, receipts, numbers meticulously tracked. I started keeping track, he said quietly. After Dad died, everything you gave us. Every check, every loan, every time you covered something because we were short. I told myself I'd pay it back. I told myself it was temporary. I looked at the folder, at years of generosity documented in my son's own hand. And in that moment I realized something. Some lessons are learned too late, but apologies can still arrive in time. And then he looked up at me, eyes searching. Not for forgiveness, not for access, but for understanding. And for the first time in years I saw my son again. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Brian sat across from me, folding and unfolding his hands, as if each movement helped him gather courage. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said finally. I'm not asking for money or access. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For the cruise. For the lies. For every time I made you feel less important than convenience. I nodded slowly, letting the words settle. Outside, a robin sang its cheerful song, unbothered by grudges or family drama. Thank you, I said softly, for saying that. He paused, then added, almost hesitantly, Emma asks about you every day. She wears the bracelet you sent her. She says it reminds her that you're still here, even when she can't see you. My chest ached with a mix of love and regret. Tell her I'm always here, I said. My voice shook. Whenever she's ready. He nodded and left, leaving the folder on the table. I sat staring at it for a long time, years of giving tracked and tallied, but it wasn't about the money. It never had been. It had always been about being seen, being valued, being treated like a person rather than a resource. I closed the folder and placed it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember. That night I wrote a letter, not to Brian, not to Karen, but to Emma. I told her about her grandfather, about how Roger and I met at a church picnic in 1975, about the life we built in this house. I wrote about values I hoped she'd carry forward. Kindness, integrity, keeping your word. I told her that love isn't always easy, that sometimes it requires boundaries. That walking away doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you've started caring about yourself too. Summer came, bringing long golden evenings and the scent of fresh-cut grass. I joined a book club, took watercolor classes on Saturday mornings, and learned to be alone without being lonely. I filled my days with things that mattered to me, not just things that mattered to others. In July, Emma visited for a week. We baked cookies, watched old movies, and walked to the park to feed ducks. She didn't ask about the fight. Maybe she didn't remember, or maybe she decided it didn't matter. On her last night, we sat on the porch swing watching fireflies blink on and off, tiny lights in the gathering darkness. Grandma, she said softly, I want to be brave like you. Maybe I am, I said. Maybe I am. The church bells rang somewhere in the distance, not as a call of loss, but as a promise of beginnings. I realized then that life isn't about the people who leave or the ones who disappoint. It's about the moments you still have, the love that remains, the choices you make to protect your own heart while still holding space for others. And in that golden summer light I understood. Even when you feel invisible, even when they say you're too old or too inconvenient, there is always a chance to begin again. Always a chance to be seen, valued, and loved on your own terms. If you've ever been told you're too fragile, too old, or too inconvenient, remember this. Beginnings can come at any age, and the strongest love is the one you give yourself first.